Welcome to our first unit in our study of African American literature. This unit is the Vernacular Tradition, which is the oral forms of expression existing prior to the African slaves' ability to read and write in English. Before they came to, or before they were brought to the Americas, most Africans spoke their main tribal language, their village language, and then they had developed sort of a pidgin language where villages could interact with one another, particularly for trade, for exchanging goods. And they brought that ability, that pidgin language ability, with them to America so that they could communicate with one another as they worked and lived together and as they started learning English. So their oral tradition kind of mingled a bit of that pidgin African languages with the English that they were learning at the time. The vernacular encompasses vigorous, dynamic processes of expression, past and present. It makes up a rich storehouse of materials wherein the values, styles, and character types of Black American life are reflected in language that is highly energized and often marvelously eloquent. We're going to use this statement as a guide to understanding the vernacular tradition and its influence on later written forms of expression. So we want to, as we go through the vernacular and as we move into the written literatures, we want to consider how we are seeing these expressions of values and styles and character types, and what makes this a highly energized and marvelously eloquent language. So some of the forms that you will find in the vernacular tradition, the Black vernacular tradition in particular, we have folk tales, jazz, drama, hip-hop, blues, visual arts, work songs, spirituals, rhymes, ballads, dance, prayers, sermons, and others. Right. In order to really understand the vernacular tradition, of course, we have to talk about what vernacular means. So the word vernacular comes from the Latin vernaculus, which means born in one's house or native, which comes from verna, which is a slave born in his master's house or a native. Modern definitions of vernacular are belonging to, developed in, and spoken or used by the people of a particular place, region, or country, native, indigenous, and also characteristic of a locality, local. In the context of American art, the vernacular may be defined as expression that springs from the creative interaction between the received or learned traditions and that which is locally invented or made in America. So if we consider this definition, we want to try to understand how Black vernacular is uniquely and distinctly American. So some of the characteristics of the Black vernacular start with the fact that most of these forms were never meant to be widely distributed. They were in-group forms of expressing realities of daily lives in America, and they were for the members of that group. It's kind of like their in-group language that they used. And as such, they were somewhat secretive. They didn't want outsiders to know really what they were talking about or what their meanings were, and they especially did not want the slave owners and traders to know what it was they were really talking about. They were defensive and aggressive in many cases, and rightly so, as they were fighting for recognition of their own humanity and fighting against the highly oppressive way of life that they were experiencing under most of their slave owners. As far as style goes, I mean, the Black vernacular was coming from the bottom of the social ladder, which actually gave it more freedom than more European-centric forms of expression, meaning that it was overlooked by the critics. It didn't have to fit the expected forms and patterns and elements of pure art and literature because it wasn't considered important enough to pay attention to. It wasn't considered literate or examples of literacy because most of the proponents of high style would have not considered the Black vernacular or its creators as even worthy of being considered human. Also, you will find shared traits of African background. So they, brought much of their culture with them. And some of the ways you can see this African background is the call and response patterns. You can see that a lot in the spirituals and some of the other secular songs where a leader will call out the lyrics that the group is meant to sing back or recite back. There's a lot of value in group creation, particularly gradual group creation, creating something over time and in a group manner so that it's not just one person but many people working together to tell a story or to create a song. And then there's this very polyrhythmically percussive dance beat orientation, and you find that a lot in the work songs and in many of the tales, the rhymes that were told, and you will find that as well once you get into more modern forms of like blues and jazz and hip-hop and all of that. And then another big thing is improvisation. So, and we see that especially in jazz, where improvisation is a skill to be greatly admired and to be developed, where you don't always have to be doing the one same thing, but you have many variations that come out naturally. Right. One thing that's really important to understand about Black vernacular is that it resists being captured on a page or in a historical frame. So if you look up other versions of some of the songs and the tales that I've provided for you, you'll see that some of them are just minor differences, maybe a word change here or there, or the order of different lines might be switched around. But you may also find that some of these pieces have great variations in them. And part of that is that there's changes in expression over time and place. And so these pieces kind of grow with the Black population as they grow and change. You may even notice that some of the lyrics I've provided to songs are a bit different than some of the recordings, and that's okay. That was actually something that was valued and not looked at as kind of, what's the right version? Because all the versions are the right version. So what does the Black vernacular do? It expresses African Americans' own ways of seeing the world, its history, and its meanings. It reveals the starkness of a life that is real, tough, and must be confronted without the convenience of formulaic dodges or wishful escapes. No fairy tale endings, no Disney versions. And it attempts to humanize an often harsh world with honesty, toughness, and in many cases, humor. So the first category of Black vernacular we're going to experience is spirituals or spiritual songs, or sacred songs if you'd like to call them that. These songs acted as powerful shields against the values of slaveholders and their killing definitions of Black humanity. Some of the common themes that are found in the spirituals were personal self-worth as children of a mighty God. These are people who, by definition of the founding fathers of our nation, were considered only 3/5 human, and that was a compromise. There were those who wanted them to be considered not human at all. And so for them to go from their home countries, their home villages, where they are very communal and they value one another, to a place where they're not even considered human, to see themselves as children of a mighty God was something that they needed. They really needed that. Another theme was, this world is not my home. I mean, most of them, the way they lived, the way they were treated was just deplorable at best. And this idea of escaping from this world was prevalent in many of their spiritual songs. And because they were spiritual songs, the home that they were looking for was heaven. And along those lines, they have the images of a steady and just King Jesus. So their slaveholders, their owners were, for the most part, not just and not steady. They weren't consistent. They weren't reliable. And they were not taking care of their slaves. They were using them. They were working them to death. And they didn't care. And so these images of a steady and just King Jesus gave them something to hold on to, gave the slaves something to hold on to, that they could look forward to a time of justice. Even though it wasn't now, they could look forward to that. There's also a common theme of rest. When you're worked and worked and worked and worked and worked and worked and worked almost to death, and in many cases to death, rest is incredibly important. And you really can't exist without it. Another theme that runs through many of these spiritual songs is reuniting with friends and kindreds. So the way that owners just bought and sold and bought and sold and bought and sold people, bought and sold their slaves, you could be separated from your spouse, your children, your parents, at the whim of one of these men who decided, well, I want this slave this other person has, so I'm going to send you to that person so I can get their slave. There was no thought of these relationships and how important they were on the part of the slaveholders. And so looking forward to reuniting with your friends and your family in this future world, this paradise, was something that could see them through some really tough times. The drivingly percussive vision of Judgment Day. Oh goodness, Judgment Day. They were looking forward to that. And along with that, we have the Old Testament God, that really strong, mighty God with his heroes and prophets, Moses, Job, Daniel, Samson, Ezekiel, and others. They saw themselves as a chosen people protected by a furiously watchful God because they needed someone to look out for them. In addition to the sacred songs, the spirituals, we have secular songs. And one thing to note is that there really isn't a hard, distinct division between sacred and secular. Many sacred elements and themes are also in the secular songs and rhymes and stories and that. So don't be surprised if you see and hear some of those. The secular songs came in a few different forms, and so we'll talk about a form and its characteristics or its purposes. So one of the forms would be parodies of sacred texts. So they would have mock sermons and mock prayers. And these provided an outlet for them to kind of say pretty much anything they wanted and needed to say. And they also served to humanize God, which kind of created a stronger connection. And even though these are secular songs and they're kind of mocking, ironically, they serve to strengthen the faith of the slaves. They also contained stinging elements of truth. I mean, they didn't hold back. And they expressed with humor the bitter disappointments of slave existence. Another form of secular songs would be the narrative rhymes, and these were dominated by hero and bad man forms. And the purpose of these forms was for the hero to outsmart the man and blow him to hell, too. These forms had a strong impact on the blues and on rap. Work songs, which we'll be looking at, were, first of all, meant to pass the time. When you're out in the fields, day after day after day after day after day, you have to have something to pass the time, and so they would sing. And many times these songs served to synchronize the work pace. So they kind of kept them going, kept the rhythm of the work going. And the content of these songs reflected on the scene that the workers witnessed each day. Secular songs might be more important than sacred songs to many blacks of the last half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. Why might this be so? And do you agree or disagree, and why? That's something you want to think about as you're looking at some of the songs that I've shared with you, maybe some that you'll find on your own, and as we start looking forward into the literatures of slavery and freedom and beyond. The other form of vernacular tradition that we are going to be looking at will be folk tales. Folk tales were a key part of African American survival and sustenance. They were what blacks had instead of freedom. So they had rights, as in ritual kind of rights, and not rights as in I have the right to go do this thing or be this person or have this item or whatever. So many times they would have storytelling competitions. And these stories helped maintain broad outlines of their original worldview. So these stories were ones that reached back into their home countries, their home villages. They were stories that they brought with them, and then they kind of molded them to fit where they were in the Americas. Excuse me. Alright, so some of the kinds of folk tales are trickster tales, tales of metamorphoses and wonder, borrowed Native American and Euro-American tales, which were retold with Black American shapes and themes, and voices marked as African American. There were turns of plot, heroes, dupes, and villains, and values that were distinctly African that were infused into these retellings. So as we go and look at the pieces that we're going to consider this week and listen to some of the songs, we want to think about some things. So here are some questions to think about. Is the idea of the vernacular dependent on definitions of racial essences that are not knowable outside the black circle? So must you be part of the circle to really understand this Black vernacular. What is Black about the Black vernacular? And when is American culture not Black and vernacular? Another thing to keep in mind is that the Black vernacular traditions inform African American literatures of slavery and freedom.